Deep in the desolate, remote mountains, a group of hikers got lost. Before they could fully process their predicament, the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, plunging them into an urgent race against the encroaching darkness. Desperation fueled their trembling legs as they pushed forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, while their dry throats made every breath a struggle. In a moment like that, what do you think they are bothered with the most? An aching hunger or the unbearable thirst? What if I say there is no right answer to this question and your choice between thirst and hunger depends only on the state that you are currently in? When George Loewenstein, a renowned economist, asked this question to two groups of participants, one group overwhelmingly said that thirst should be the most unpleasant feeling, but the other group did not. Reason? The first group was made to perform a 20-minute cardio session before they participated in that study. They let their own thirst influence their predictions and sided with thirst instead of hunger. On the other hand, the latter group that did not exercise did not overwhelmingly choose thirst, unlike the first one. This experiment reveals that we tend to care and give a shit only when we have walked in the shoes of the other person. But this tendency isn't limited between people. We unconsciously act in the same way when it comes to treating our own selves. For example, when hungry, we tend to overorder and then either waste that food or end up overeating, which, compounded over time, adds inches to our waistline. But can't we see that we are overordering? Well, similar to the second group, we can use our intellect to judge if we are overordering or not. However, the emotions of impulsiveness and fear of missing out induced by hunger takes over. Same goes for our recurring thoughts about quitting a toxic job on bad days only to ditch that plan at the end of the month. This tendency, where individuals nested in their current mental state struggle to understand or predict the emotional state of others or even their own, is called the empathy gap. In this video, we explain why empathy gaps make people apathetic towards others and themselves, its devastating effects, and its tendency to act as a trigger towards self-discovery. Our ability to empathize depends on one single thing: a shared emotional state. The first group of participants could empathize only when they shared the same emotional state as the hikers. Simply put, until we have suffered the same thing, we cannot empathize. That means, in order to be empathetic, we must accumulate a large number of exclusive and vivid experiences. Obviously, that is unlikely to happen because the majority of people simply avoid problems, let alone experience them for someone else. As a result, it seems like we collectively settle for another feeling: sympathy, a feeling of sincere concern for someone who is experiencing something difficult or painful. Many times it is expressed by a show of kindness or pity. We know that empathy, unlike sympathy, is not a mental dance of pity within our minds for ourselves or for others. Instead, it is the ability to understand and share the same state of mind as the other person. However, despite clear distinction, people mistake sympathy for empathy all the time, and the reason behind that is societal conditioning. We learn to express pity and concern as some kind of virtue for others to see in ourselves. If we want people to care for each other and bridge the empathy gap, we must begin by separating the idea of sympathy from empathy. There is a simple way to do that, and that is by understanding the two states of emotional engagement: the hot state and the cold state. A cold state of emotional engagement is the one that is not influenced by emotion. A cold state is usually more rational and logical, while the hot mental state is influenced by hunger, sexual desire, fear, exhaustion, and other strong emotions. A cold to hot empathy gap happens when someone is in a cold state has trouble understanding someone in a hot or emotional state, generally as a result of underestimating the influence that emotions, impulses, and visceral drives have on the individual in the hot state. A common example of cold to hot empathy gap could be loading the Titanic with only 20 lifeboats despite having a capacity of 64 lifeboats instead. The key people at the shipping company that owned the Titanic were in a cold state. They could not visualize a hot emotional state the passengers can find themselves in the event of a catastrophe. Cold to hot empathy gap also applies to the case of the Challenger disaster. NASA engineers and managers in the cold state underestimated the risk of launching the space shuttle in unusually cold weather. They overlooked warnings from engineers about the potential failures of the O-rings at low temperatures, which led them to this tragic event. Unlike empathy, the idea of hot and cold states of emotional engagement is absent when practicing sympathy. Putting yourself in the opposite mental state demands responsibility and accountability, but on the other hand, being sympathetic is more about norms and a display of your kindness, or perhaps avoiding to come across as heartless to the rest of the world. The ease of expressing pity, the reward of virtue signaling, and the comfort of inaction akin to sympathy becomes the way of life before we even know it. And this isn't limited to interpersonal empathy gaps alone. Sympathy also leads to intrapersonal empathy gaps as well. Because sympathy is characterized by an outward expression, it needs a sympathizer on a higher ground and a victim, someone being pitied. But without the victim, one cannot project all the sympathy onto themselves because it puts them into a tough spot. Before the person could recognize the two states, before they could empathize, they tend to escape. Compounded many years, this lack of reflection becomes emotional detachment. Before you even know, you develop a quick fix mentality while suffering with guilt and lack of emotional resilience. While our habit of practicing sympathy out of conditioning majorly drives the empathy gap, a list of other factors also play a part. For example, our tendency to empathize more towards our preferred group, religion, gender, family, and friends for our own benefits defeats the idea of empathy in general. Additionally, tribalism in the form of blind belief on the narratives coming out of echo chambers can also lead to less authenticity, feeling fewer emotion for others, and further broadening of this gap. Unfortunately, our society in the current times has reached a point where this gap is wider than ever, and it feels like nobody really cares. Some of you may think, what if we could switch our mental states at our will? Well, that is possible, but momentarily. Perhaps after watching a movie or reading a poem maybe. However, that feeling is unlikely to sustain. You might get a whiff of warm air, but eventually the lure of the cold state is going to take over. So, how on earth we permanently become more empathetic and collectively create a society where people really care, where they give it? To become permanently empathetic, we would need to be in a hot state for a long time. Yes, it is proven and is a fact that traumatized kids go on to become more empathetic than kids who had a normal childhood. These are the people who can really put themselves in other people's shoes or situations that are foreign to them, making them considerate towards others and themselves. Often, they could be black sheep of the family who were forced to perpetually remain in a hot state and predict everyone's emotions. In the latter part of their life, as these people learn to let go of their guilt and build their self-esteem, they could build great companies or become amazing creators. Their uncanny ability to switch between the hot and cold states of their audience or target customers makes them truly magical. It seems like elongated duration of hot states are not that bad for long-term growth. However, that doesn't mean that people are going to throw themselves into hot states and leave their cold state permanently. It is because despite being unfulfilling, it is too big of a risk to ditch the cold state and suffer in the hot state. This is when uncertain life events play their part. You see, we face these hot states every day as we are living our lives, be it road rage or over-ordering food, but they are often easy to get over. They do not push us into a shared mental state, but when an uncertain event throws us into an elongated hot state, we cannot help but realize and feel. During this phase, our ego and our tendency of virtue signaling is stripped off, which ultimately chokes our sympathy to death. These phases are often lonely because most people around us are perpetually in a cold state. Due to lack of shared state, the individual cannot connect to most people. This is when people who thrive off our sympathy may say things like, "Oh, they have become so mean and uncaring." It is because these people haven't been through the ringer yet. These people are likely in a cold state that they find unfulfilling for reasons they cannot explain. Meanwhile, the individual is now sent into a deep state of introspection and finds everything that is wrong with them. And in this quest to improve, they end up becoming empathetic towards themselves first. After a while, when the work on self is over, they relate those realizations to others and become empathetic towards the outside world as well. So in conclusion, it is not like people do not care or don't give a but the fact is, everyone is on their own journey at their own pace. It is fine if someone comes across indifferent or appears unfazed by our suffering. Perhaps they haven't faced a long and difficult hot state in their lives. Like the majority, perhaps they are in a cold state. In the end, we must realize that we are merely playing a part in each other's lives. Perhaps we are all work in progress and we're collectively put into a situation to help the other person decondition and find their true self. Please like, share and subscribe if you loved the content.